Hello, neighbors. It is so good to be with you today. You know, Mr. Rogers was on television for over 33 years. And with a 5-day-a-week television show, it is probably not a long stretch to suggest that we knew some of Mr. Rogers' neighbors better than our own. Some of those beloved characters that came into our home and to our lives every single week. Mr. McFeely, Lady Aberlin, Neighbor Aber. When Fred Rogers was presented with the Lifetime Emmy Award in 1997, he was described in that show as the best neighbor that any of us ever had. But what if being a good neighbor? What if being a loving and kind and incredibly compassionate and merciful and loving and friendly neighbor wasn't some distant, idealized concept that was just on a television show? What if that was something that we lived? What if that was something that we were as followers of Christ? We decided to spend the season of Lent talking about the concept of being a good neighbor, moving through these 40-plus days walking with Jesus and thinking and looking for the ways that we can grow in love of God and neighbor and self. I want to give a special thanks to Armanda Vanderheiden, who helped to inspire and encourage this particular series. But our hope is that all of us will have a chance in this time to think about how we are a neighbor in practical and tangible ways that will actually make a tangible and noticeable impact on our community. I hope that Rochester and Olmsted County looks different on Easter Sunday than it does today. Now, our scripture reading for today, as Mary read so beautifully for us and referenced, is known as the parable of the Good Samaritan, and it's really a classic neighboring text. It begins, of course, though, with a question, with this lawyer coming to Jesus, asking about the way to eternal life, to full life. Now, he knows what to say as far as the commandments go. He knows that the word of the Torah is to love God and neighbor as yourself, to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and being. But the place where the lawyer seems to get hung up is who my neighbor is. I mean, who for real? Who exactly? Who precisely? Because not everybody can really be my neighbor, practically speaking. So Jesus, if you could just give a little insight about how exactly I might do this loving my neighbor thing, it would be most appreciated. And so Jesus, in typical Jesus style, tells a story. And he tells this story of the man who's injured while going along the Jericho road. There's a lot of emphasis, as there should be, on the first two folks who walked by, the priest and the Levite, both religious people, who would have typically been expected to do the right thing, to stop and to help this man. Now, we don't know why they didn't. Maybe they were on their way someone else. Maybe they had something really important to do. Maybe they were already helping someone and they were on their way to some kind of an emergency. But whatever their rationale, it is at least worth questioning, if not critiquing, the fact that they did not choose to stop and to help this injured man in front of them. Now, the Samaritan, of course, would have been the unexpected neighbor. There was a historical conflict between Jews and Samaritans. And so this person who did ultimately stop to help and be a neighbor would have been like the villain turned neighbor. Help from an unexpected source. But I don't know if you noticed that when the lawyer phrases the question to Jesus, it's, who is my neighbor? But what Jesus responds with the story of the Good Samaritan, kind of turns the question back to the lawyer. And he's really asking the lawyer who he is willing to see as his neighbor. Who he is willing to be a neighbor too. In other words, neighbor isn't really about whether someone is worthy to receive love. It's about whether someone is willing to offer it. Reverend Dr. Mary Hinkle Shore has written that. And I would add that to that, neighbor is not really about where someone lives or what group they belong to, but how we choose to see them and to interact with them and to offer ourselves in vulnerable relationship with them. Now, I think this is going to be a really important focus for us through the season of Lent because it calls us not just to recognize who our neighbors are, but how we are being called to neighbor, the verb, to be neighbors, to actively act neighboring. The one who showed him mercy. This is the way to life. Jesus tells us everything we need to know in this story about who our neighbor is. And it isn't about who someone else is. It's who we are willing to be and to see and to live and to love. We'll be using as our congregational read during this season a book called The Art of Neighboring by Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon. This is not the only text on neighboring. I want to make sure you understand that. We'll be using other voices and sources as we go along through this time. But one of the things that drew us to this particular book is that the authors really talk about the art of neighboring and being a neighbor, loving our neighbors, not as some vague Christian principle like being nice that we all just kind of live into halfway, but something very specific that we can actually do. They tell a story of a gathering with other pastors in Denver several years ago when they were wanting to start a series on serving their community. And so they invited the mayor of Denver to come and speak to this group of pastors about how they could help. And the mayor came to them and said that really, the vast majority of issues that were facing their community would be dramatically reduced, if not outright eliminated, if Denver could just become a community of great neighbors. And so after the mayor left, Jay, one of these authors, turned to the other pastors and said, "Am I the only one here who's a little embarrassed? I mean, we just asked how we can best serve our city, and the mayor essentially said that it would be great if we could just get our folks to obey the second half of the Great Commandment. If you just did what you said you want to do. If you just lived into who you say that you are. What an incredible impact that would have on our city. Neighboring not in the abstract, but in the particular. One of the challenges that is in this book is to evaluate whether we know the 8 households who live closest to us. If you've seen the image on the front of the book, it's a grid showing 9 squares, and that's the concept that they're referencing with that image. Do you know, beyond just names, if you even know names, I don't know all those names, of the 8 households who live closest to you? Do you know anything about them? Do you know who they are? Would they say that they know who you are? What if the call to love God and love our neighbors is actually about loving our neighbors, our real neighbors, the people who actually live near us? And the good news is that we can do that. So we have this dual purpose for this topic during the season of Lent here at CUMC. We want, absolutely, to encourage you to get to know your actual neighbors, wherever you live, whatever neighborhood you live in, to get to know those folks. If you know them already, to get to know them better, to go further out from the 8 households that are around you, to share stories, to begin to get to know who people are, maybe even, if it's possible in your context, to have a meal with them. But also, We want you, as part of this series, to learn about our neighbors here in Rochester and Olmsted County. The neighbors that might live outside of your actual neighborhood, but who are still a part of our community. We want to talk honestly about who our neighbors are, who's here, what makes a good neighborhood or a bad part of town, and how we break through those stereotypes and those misunderstandings and those really lack of relationship to understand who we are. How do we get to know the people who might not be in our route from home to work, to church, to the restaurant, to the coffee shop, to school? Or maybe people that we see on that route every day and haven't had a chance to meet. How do we know them? How do we offer ourselves in love and relationship and learn more about people who live in this community, including people that we might think we have trouble loving, people whose yard signs are not our favorite, people who have done something to upset us, people who seem so dramatically different from us that we don't think we can have anything in common. Let's be clear, those people might be across town, but they might also be down the street. They might also be sitting down the pew from you right now. They might be in your own household. It is clear that loving our neighbor is not at all about where someone lives, but how we live in love with each other. How we give ourselves as neighbors, not as superheroes swooping in to come in and give ourselves in this patronizing way to do something for other people, but to be in vulnerable, loving relationship, real, authentic relationship. How we also give ourselves because we too need to be loved. There's a neighborhood in the south part of Brooklyn that's known as Little Odessa. It's Brighton Beach is that part of Brooklyn, and it's earned the name Little Odessa because the number of immigrants since the late 1970s who have come there from former Soviet Union countries, including Russia and Ukraine. Now, you would imagine in a neighborhood like this with such a large population of folks from Russia and Ukraine and other European countries that there's potential for significant tension amongst these folks who are neighbors and have been living practically side by side for decades now. And I'm sure that those tensions are present in some form or another. But there's also this incredible, remarkable support that is coming out of Little Odessa right now for the people of Ukraine. People are making donations, incredible donations of diapers, of clothing, of medical supplies. They're piling up. Folks are volunteering to sort these supplies who have loved ones who are in the midst of this war right now and really just are looking for something to do with their time so that they don't spend all day worrying about the loved ones that they haven't heard from. The Russian American Officers Association, which is the Russian-speaking branch and part of the NYPD, has set up collection boxes all around the city collecting supplies for the people of Ukraine. The priest of the local Catholic Church in Little Odessa has said that people are calling in to ask how they can help, and he can tell when folks have a slight Russian accent but are trying to kind of hide it because they feel a little shy about calling to offer their support. The title of this article highlighting Little Odessa comes from Reuters, and it reads, "In New York's Little Odessa, Ukrainians see Russians as neighbors, not enemies." What a witness. Loving our neighbors is incredibly central to who we are as people of faith. And it has the potential to change us. I really believe it has the potential to change the world. At the very least in this season, to change our community. One person and one neighbor and one relationship at a time. Are you ready to begin?